biological profile is a key piece to a forensic anthropologist's toolkit when conducting a forensic investigation. And as anthropologists, we don't normally associate ourselves with a lot of sticky, gooey flesh stuff. We stick primarily to osseous tissue, such as bone. Biological profile is an estimation of a deceased individual's age, sex, ancestry, stature, and pathology, which can be deduced using a process of elimination called a differential diagnosis. It's commonly used in the medical field and can be utilized when assessing remains and pathologies that the individual in question has suffered. We're primarily being focused on that of the skeleton. Some of the aspects of the biological profile are a little bit more difficult to discern than others. This makes certainty of our assessments a little bit obscure and a little bit questionable. Because of this, estimations are generally phrased as traits consistent with, traits associated with, and so forth. And this is fine, but when it comes to you and the judge in the courtroom, and you're sitting there with your papers of research about to propose to a room full of people under sworn oath of the law that this person has consistent traits and characteristics with this kind of profile, pressure really gets on you, and other people in the room are not going to know what you mean by Swigan or Brooks and Sushi, Ousley and Chance, or whoever you bring up in the estimation of your profile. So we're going to be starting with sex. Sex estimation can come from a variety of different osseous remains, ranging from estimates of
head, shoulders, knees, and toes. No, not the toes.
Globally, dimorphism is super variable, so it's not an overstatement to take care in the standards you apply to John Smith, who's already having a bad time, aka he's dead. And when analyzing for sexually dimorphic traits, it's important to keep in mind the variations within these different populations, specifically on inter- and intra-population variation. In your best scenario, you want to go with the osteocox. The anomalous features give a best case, best estimate of a sex estimation in a forensic case. The auricular surface and the morphology of the pelvis are generally good giveaways when it comes to this style of estimation. Bradley and Jantz from 2011 make a pretty good case of using postcranial elements such as the humeri or even the femur in analyzing for sex. Using the FDB's database for testing of sex estimation methods, they were able to have a massive sample size for the distinction of whether the cranium or postcranial elements were more efficacious in sex estimation, though it is worth mentioning that the data was insufficient for East Asian and Native American individuals. Take just a moment and think what would be better, postcranial elements or the skull in estimation. Get that noggin thinking. I know that Edwig has been working on you and it's hard, it's terrible, school is awful. Cranial elements actually show a higher degree of accuracy in a multivariate analysis. Multivariate analyses comprise of multiple measurements of traits. In addition to this, Spikestrut and Ubelacher in 1994 collected a lot of data on skeletal traits of the mastoid process, supraorbital margin, supraorbital ridge, the nuchal crest, and the mental eminence of the relation to sex. Dealing with the nominate features, Gonzalez in 2009 analyzed accuracy of sex estimation via the greater sciatic notch and the ischiopubic complex morphology using semi-landmark and multivariate statistical methods. In the end, he found a 90.9% accuracy for these methods with the greater sciatic notch, as well as a 90.1% accuracy for the ischiopubic complex. There's a higher degree of misclassifications with females and males in this study. However, we all know no study is perfect. Next up is age. This one is a fun one because much of the analysis focuses particularly on the growth of the bone, namely at the sites of fusion. As you grow some bones, additional pieces during the process of endochondral ossification, and those parts fuse together and can be used for sex estimation. One example of this would be the proximal part of your humerus. These must be evaluated for the degree of closure, due to the amount of years between initial and final closure, and can give varying levels of accuracy and precision dependent upon the location. Also, did you know that when you're 25, your bones stop growing, and after they stop growing, they end up just starting to deteriorate over time? Yeah, I knew that we were all just dying inside. But this is important to know. As with the analysis of mature remains, methods will be more involved with the generation of the skeletal structure and pertain more to the microscopic structure and the features of dentition. Also, environmental factors and life histories of individuals can produce degenerative traits upon the skeleton, not related with age, and can cause age or degree of error. The older someone gets, the more increase in this variation we will see, and this is why there is such an emphasis on utilizing more than one indicator of age estimation in the biological profile. Going on, there's an important distinction to be understood when estimating for age: physiological age and chronological age. Chronological age refers to the exact age a person is, down to the day, minute, hour, and second. As physiological age essentially is how old a person may seem. For example, you have a person who is super stressed all the time and it starts to manifest on their physical body. This can also be applied to the skeleton. Because of these stress markers, they could be perceived as older. And in the same vein, we can interpret skeletal remains as older or younger than they are due to their appearance. With accepted age indicators, there are four main principles. 1. Morphological changes proceed unidirectionally with age. 2. features have a high correlation with chronological age. 3, they occur roughly at the same age in all individuals, or at least within a distinguishable subgroup. 4, characteristics are measured or classified with known intra and inter-observer error rates. There are also specific standards appropriate for population of origin of the individual remains. And when these aren't available, standards with greater variance are recommended, with references such as these. Sensuchi revitalize a work from Aksaidi and Namaskari utilizing the pubic symphysis. They use a stage of development method that would ANN only focus on 5 primary stages on early and late morphological changes. Sensuchi created a 6-phase model with a bit more rounded out stages of development, creating 12 total models for both sexes, while including incredibly detailed descriptions of each phase and aspect that you will want to account for in your estimation. Hello? Obturator? What's the next one? Oh, that's right, stature! When estimating for stature, there are 2 primary manners to go about it. This starts with measurement of the bones that constitute the components of stature, summed up and corrected for the additional soft tissue. This is when you use all of the bone comprising the height of an individual, or using a regression method applied with the measurement of a single compact bone. Other methods also include using incomplete limb bones, non-limb bones, and other alternative methods, but these must be selected with consideration of the population, sex, and temporal cohort the individual resides from, and is dependent upon the condition of the remains. Now, obviously, the optimal scenario is using complete remains and using anatomical methods when they are present. However, that's not always going to be our case. So that's where we want to turn to alternative methods such as regression formulas. Regression will either estimate bone length, then estimate the stature from that and compound the error within the assessment, or estimate the stature directly from the fragment and forget about all the error nonsense because you and your measurements are perfect. Along with this, there are some additional considerations. Stature does decrease with age, and the anatomical method provides an accurate height estimate at time of death. But with regression methods, they will often estimate for a maximum height of the individual and not include this in the reduction factor. My French bread just finished. Don't you even freaking dare, you little pizza pie. Oh my gosh. Look at this. Look at this beautiful French bread. As I'm sure you would have guessed, there's not always perfection in regression formulas. Estimating with those leaves some individuals falling outside of their typical stature interval for their population, such as with persons of shorter or taller height, and this can result in some less accurate estimations. And pathological conditions may also affect stature as well. Trotter and Leister's method is one that is quite commonly used amongst Asian males and white females. However, due to a study from Janssen in 1995, concluded that in Trotter's final measurements of the tibia, the medial malleolus was omitted and was a critical error that was not accounted for on the maximum length of the lung. This has spurred a lot of other scientists to critique, correct these errors, published in her papers of 1952 and 1970. On 3 measurements, in Janssen's paper of these same long bones finds an average of a 10 to 12 millimeter greater length from Trotter's measurements and results in stature more akin to that of the regional population of the individuals in this area, individuals of the Caribbean. Other studies, such as Owsley in 1995, begin to suggest which matter of stature should we estimate for, biological or forensic. In the conclusion, they suggest utilization of the forensic stature, as that is all that we're able to use for a missing person, and find that biological stature is less precise, even in the best of circumstances. Forensic stature also yields a prediction interval, which, while may not be definite in its distinction, still narrows down our window of identification. There are some complications and non-approved considerations to take into account in estimation in this matter, such as Trotter's formula and the improper adjustments and measurements made there, which were her exclusion of medial malleolus, and thus her method measurement is not accepted by Swigan. We also don't want to report a range for stature estimation when based on regression formula. Interval is a more appropriate term. Now on to the more controversial aspect of the biological profile, ancestry, and this refers to the geographic region or ancestral origin of a population. There's more similarity than differences in modern population, as 85% of the worldwide morphology in the United States can be used as a descriptor of a group membership when constructing a forensic report. However, we see from the Daganji paper this year, there's a lot of complications surrounding these elements of social race and ancestry. We'll cover this a little bit later. Particularly, biological measures can be found in varying correlation with ethnic category, though keep in mind these can still be incorrect due to the flawed correlation between biology and social race. A lot of these measurements depend upon trait frequencies, though no one group has a single distinctive characteristic. Skeletal traits can only be diagnostic of a specific group and not characteristic. Complex groups do cause more difficulty with classification, such as the Hispanic ethnic. When approaching an investigation, a sample reference or group should always be used, but must always be evaluated in regards to sample size, temporal period, geographic location, ethnicity, language, and any other cultural criteria and activities. And these can result in a modification of the skeleton. Again, we have no clear-cut indicators of ancestry, so the use of statistical methods are helpful in classifications as they give us the measure of error. An assessment of remains for ancestry should always involve multiple methods of estimation using morphological and metric traits. Morphological traits pertain to morphoscopic traits, primarily within the cranium, mandible, and the teeth, and these are reported in degrees of expression. These traits are used with appropriate reference groups, clear trait descriptions, and appropriate statistical methods of classification. The metric, on the other hand, generally involves assessment with the cranial size and shape and should be used with appropriate instruments and standards or software. Again, they use with the same three criteria as the morphological traits. Again, we must always be aware of pathological or taphonomic alterations that can obstruct our assessment of techniques and adjust accordingly. Additionally, we must also remember to use a variety of techniques in order to diversify the traits we are assessing for. A modern example of methods used today for ancestry estimation would be Ousley in 2009, discussing the use of Bayesian length on the skull as well as Bayesian postheon length, and finds a separation of American blacks and whites about 80% correctly and classifies the samples into social race 97% correct. They state that their results indicate significant differences between these two groups and support an assertion from Sauer in 1992 that there are morphological differences between American blacks and whites that can be visually appreciated. This kind of reflects upon their title, Anthropologists Are Good at Measuring Race. In the study, in light of previous literature, they appear to be a little bit too presumptuous of their ability to measure race by craniometric data. Although at the conclusion of the paper, it is stated that with other biological systems and traits, the distribution and number of biological races will change. But due to positive assortative mating and institutional racism, the social phenomenon of race has been able to continue to exist. They do end on a progressive note, quoting Livingstone in 1962 that there are no races, only populations. This does appear to be a manner of them looking from the inside out on this subject, and by that previous quote are working in the direction in which Deganji and her colleagues wish to turn anthropology. However, it is uncertain to say of their true perspectives, so we may have to take this with a grain of salt. But this final quote from Livingstone they mentioned is exactly what Deganji and her colleagues are wishing to work away from in the paper I mentioned before, speaking from the failure of law enforcement and their effects of reflection upon overdue discussion of ancestry estimation, illustrating it through two main points. One, an immediate halt in the use of morphoscopic and cranial traits in ancestry estimation due to the lack of understanding of why the traits exist and the prolongment of the debunked biological race concept. And two, a call to action to examine how ancestry estimations and forensic reports may hinder identification efforts. Their points come from unequal treatment of identified persons, for example, missing white women syndrome, and faulty logic that has come to be used for classification and heritability. Overall, it's a judgment of ethics with our methods in anthropology, and especially for forensic cases, we should be using traits for identification which we understand over those we guess at. And Deganji wraps it up in two essential sentences. One, which is just because you can does not mean you should, and if we do not have these conversations now, will we ever? Now on to pathology. Pathology has to do with antemortem processes, which are processes that occur before death, and give us a leg up in presuming an identification, though should only be as definitive as reasonably possible from our assessment. Our detail is crucial here, and as much of the observation as possible should be documented. Pathological conditions are a manifestation of abnormal change when the normative anatomy resulting of a disease can be recognized grossly, geographically, or histologically, and diagnoses may include chronic infectious diseases. These are most commonly associated with the appearance of pathological conditions and lesions upon the skull. There are also anomalies which are likely to be present during an observation. Anytime someone is examining for any of these pathological conditions, lesions, anomalies, and so forth, you always should assess them in comparison with standard clinical and research models. Any interpretation should be supported by clinical documentation, case studies, and literature from forensic investigations providing the observer with ample detail for sufficient documentation, description using bench notes, diagram sketches, and photographs for reference, and only reporting supporting conclusions, as well as presenting only all interpretations and evidence. The manner in which a specialist will discern existence of a pathological condition is through a differential diagnosis, which I mentioned before, which is a process of elimination, narrowing down possibilities rather than leading to a single diagnosis, but a list of possibilities. Upon constructing a differential diagnosis, accepted terminology is quite essential in this. This includes descriptors such as lytics, proliferative, deformative, and so forth. Descriptions should also acknowledge overall shape and size, extent of the bone involved, anatomically described, such as the proximal end of a tibia, the distribution on the bone, the remainder of the bone, including the articular surface, adjacent bones, and damage to the bone should also be acknowledged upon examination. Some other aspects to keep in mind that may affect the skeleton can mislead an examiner are pseudopathology, occupational markers, and secular, temporal, and geographic effects. Pseudopathologies are skeletal changes that can mimic pathological conditions and lesions, such as taphonomic alterations like rodent gnawing or insect damage. Occupational markers are general stressors that appear upon the bone from repetitive activity during life. So if you have a job that uses your arms a lot, you're probably going to have a lot of wear and tear on those wrist and forearm bones, such as the ulna, radii, and the carpals. Secular, temporal, and geographic effects refer to the conditions suggestive of a regional origin. However, due to increased access to advances in medical care and a standard of living, this has become a lot less often of an occurrence on the human skeleton. The biological profile is a complex and intricate map one creates to detail an individual in a forensic investigation, covering a variety of aspects, each with their own respective manner of conclusions that must be taken into account with respect to every investigation. No two cases will ever be the same. Aspects of stature, age, and sex are commonalities that our methods have become accustomed to and enhanced with decades of trial and error. However, with the more complex and controversial attributes, such as ancestry and pathological conditions, there's a lot more divisive thought that we need to take upon when diagnosing or finding consistency within those estimations. Our understanding of not just the skeletal morphology, but the forces that act upon it, and how we perceive these individuals post-mortem, and the time we take to assure accuracy in our estimation, all center upon this subject, whether it is a criminal case investigation, test of our skills, or used for bioarchaeological purposes. It is a crucial skill to not just forensic science, but what it means to be an anthropologist. Thank you for watching, thank you for this semester, and I hope you all have a very happy Thanksgiving.